The courtroom buzzed with quiet murmurs, the kind of tension that felt heavy enough to sit on your shoulders. People leaned forward in their seats, trying to catch every detail of the day's proceedings. It wasn't often that a trial like this happened, a high-profile case involving a wealthy businessman who had been in the headlines for months. The public had been watching every twist and turn, and now, the day everyone had been waiting for had arrived. The defendant walked into the courtroom with an air of confidence that bordered on arrogance. He wore a tailored suit, expensive shoes, and a smug expression that seemed to say, "I am untouchable." His every movement spoke of a life that had been built on privilege. Security personnel flanked him, keeping a careful eye on the audience, though no one seemed ready, or even daring to challenge him. People whispered about him, some with awe, others with disgust. At the front of the room, the judge sat behind a large, imposing bench. She wasn't just any judge, she had a reputation for fairness, intelligence, and the kind of integrity that didn't bow to pressure. The judge had spent decades in the legal system, and her presence demanded respect. She was calm, composed, and completely focused on the proceedings, as if the world outside didn't matter at all. The audience noticed the contrast immediately. On one side, a man who believed money and status could shield him from accountability. On the other, a judge whose authority wasn't derived from wealth or influence, but from knowledge, experience, and an unwavering sense of justice. It was the kind of dynamic that made people lean forward in their seats, knowing something significant was about to happen. As the clerk called the case, the defendant was summoned to stand. Normally, anyone entering the courtroom would rise as a sign of respect for the judge, a basic, almost instinctive gesture. But this man hesitated. He looked around the room, a faint smirk playing on his lips, as if testing the reactions of everyone present. Then, deliberately, he remained seated. A ripple ran through the courtroom. Gasps, whispers, and murmurs filled the air. Some people were shocked, unable to believe what they had just seen. Others, more familiar with the defendant's arrogance, merely shook their heads, expecting this kind of behavior. Lawyers on both sides exchanged glances, and even some of the court officers looked momentarily taken aback. It wasn't just disrespect. It was calculated, deliberate, and almost daring. The judge didn't react immediately. Her eyes lifted, calm and steady, scanning the room as if measuring the weight of the moment. She didn't raise her voice, didn't pound her gavel. She simply waited. Her patience was a quiet assertion of authority, the kind that made it clear she wasn't about to be intimidated. The defendant leaned back in his chair, crossing one leg over the other, clearly enjoying the attention. He muttered something under his breath, but it was too soft to hear. The courtroom caught it anyway, because the tone of defiance was unmistakable. It was the kind of subtle show of disrespect that said, "I don't answer to anyone here." Whispers grew louder among the audience. People began speculating about his reasons. Some thought it was pride, pure and simple. Others suggested it was a test, a way to see if the judge would react or if her reputation for calm would crack under pressure. Whatever the motive, the act had already made its mark. In the hush that followed, it was clear that the dynamics of the courtroom had shifted. The judge finally spoke, her voice steady, confident, and carrying the authority of someone who had spent years mastering her craft. She reminded the defendant of the courtroom rules, explaining that standing for the judge was a basic requirement, a sign of respect for the law itself. Her words were measured without anger, yet they carried weight that made even the most arrogant person pause. The defendant, of course, didn't respond in the way the judge or anyone expected. He leaned back further, tilting his head slightly, a smirk still on his face. It was the kind of gesture that made people in the courtroom shift uneasily in their seats. Some were angry, some were incredulous. The judge, however, did not flinch. Her expression remained calm, unreadable, but there was an undeniable firmness in her tone that said she would not allow the situation to escalate without consequence. The tension in the room was palpable. You could almost feel it pressing down on everyone, the kind of pressure that makes you hold your breath without even realizing it. Reporters scribbled furiously in their notebooks, recording every detail. Spectators whispered among themselves, speculating on what would happen next. Even the jury members, usually instructed to stay neutral and detached, exchanged subtle glances that revealed their disbelief. Outside the courtroom, people had already begun discussing the scene on social media. Clips of the defendant sitting defiantly had gone viral, spreading like wildfire. Memes, commentary, and heated debates erupted almost instantly. Some people criticized him for arrogance and disrespect, while others seemed fascinated by his audacity. It was the kind of moment that reminded everyone why this case had drawn such attention in the first place. Inside the courtroom, the judge continued. She did not let the defendant's defiance go unchecked, but she didn't rise to the bait either. She reminded him gently but firmly that the courtroom was a place of law and order, where personal feelings or social status had no bearing. Every word she spoke carried authority, not because of volume or aggression, but because of the quiet strength behind it. The defendant shifted in his seat, a flicker of annoyance crossing his face. For a moment it seemed as though he was reconsidering, as though the calm power of the judge might actually intimidate him. But then he straightened, lifting his chin ever so slightly, clearly unwilling to show weakness in front of the crowd. It was a silent battle, a clash of arrogance and authority, pride and principle. Observers in the courtroom noticed how the audience reacted differently. Some people were rooting silently for the judge, admiring her composure and the way she held power without showing anger. Others, more skeptical, wondered if the defendant's wealth might let him escape consequences. The subtle tension between hope and fear, respect and defiance, made the room electric. Even the lawyers were affected. The prosecution saw an opportunity to emphasize the principle of accountability, to show that even the richest and most powerful individuals could not flout the rules. The defense, on the other hand, attempted to minimize the incident, hoping to frame it as a minor act of independence or eccentricity, but everyone knew the truth. This was more than just a minor gesture. This was a deliberate act that challenged authority, questioned the respect due to the legal system, and tested the patience of a judge renowned for her fairness. For a moment, the courtroom seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the inevitable next move. The defendant's gaze shifted around the room, meeting the eyes of spectators, lawyers, and reporters alike. There was a sense of arrogance that bordered on audacity, a belief that he could bend the courtroom to his will. Yet, beneath the surface, there was also a hint of uncertainty, a subtle recognition that perhaps the judge was not someone to be trifled with. And then, just as the tension seemed unbearable, the judge made a small but significant gesture. She adjusted her robe, looked directly at the defendant, and spoke with measured clarity. There was no shouting, no dramatics, only a quiet but unyielding reminder that respect was not optional in her courtroom. Her words were simple, direct, and carried the weight of decades of experience. Everyone in her court was equal before the law, and no display of wealth or arrogance could change that fact. The effect was immediate. Even the most casual observers could feel the shift. The audience leaned in closer, the air itself seeming to tighten around the courtroom. The defendant remained seated, but there was a subtle change in his posture, an almost imperceptible tension that suggested he was beginning to realize the magnitude of what he had done. The judge didn't rush. She let the silence hang, letting the weight of the law and the authority of her position settle over the room. It was a masterclass in patience and control, a reminder that true power often doesn't shout. It commands attention quietly, decisively, and irrevocably. Outside, the world waited eagerly for news. Cameras flashed, reporters whispered into microphones, and social media lit up with speculation. Everyone wanted to know what would happen next, whether the defendant would finally stand, and how the judge would respond. Inside, the courtroom felt like a stage, every person playing a part in a drama that was unfolding in real time, a story that would soon make headlines across the city. The moment hung there, suspended between defiance and dignity, arrogance and justice. It was more than just a procedural detail. It was a test of character, a confrontation between entitlement and authority, and a reminder that respect is earned, not demanded. The defendant's decision to remain seated had set the stage. The judge's quiet command had asserted the law, and the audience, watching intently, understood that something significant had just begun. A chain of events that would test not only the defendant's pride, but also the principles of justice itself. For now, the courtroom waited. The whispers faded to a tense hush as everyone prepared for the next moment, the moment when the law would speak louder than wealth, and the truth of the courtroom would unfold in front of everyone's eyes. The courtroom remained tense, but now there was a new layer to the atmosphere, a quiet buzz of curiosity and disbelief. Everyone present had seen the defiance, and now they were waiting to see how it would unfold. The defendant leaned back in his chair, arms crossed with the kind of confidence that seemed to say he could challenge the rules of the courtroom without fear of consequences. Yet beneath that confidence there was a subtle hint of unease, a flicker of recognition that perhaps the situation was not entirely under his control. Around him, spectators whispered quietly, trying to make sense of the scene. Some shook their heads, muttering about arrogance and privilege. Others exchanged surprised glances as if silently asking, "Did that really just happen?" A few people more familiar with legal proceedings knew immediately that the defendant's refusal to stand was more than just disrespect. It was a deliberate challenge, a test of authority. The lawyers in the room were all paying close attention. The prosecution saw this as an opportunity, a way to highlight the importance of accountability. They could point to this moment as proof that even someone with wealth and influence could not bend the law to their will. The defense team, on the other hand, looked concerned, aware that their client's behavior could easily backfire. They whispered among themselves, trying to craft explanations or justifications that might soften the impact of the defiance. The judge, however, remained calm. She had been through countless cases, and she understood that moments like this were not about personal offense. They were about maintaining the integrity of the courtroom. She didn't need to raise her voice or strike her gavel. Her presence alone was enough to command attention. Every movement, every glance she gave carried the weight of experience, authority, and an unshakable commitment to fairness. The defendant, still seated, shifted slightly in his chair. He looked toward the gallery of spectators, perhaps expecting some reaction that would support his arrogance. Instead, he found silent observation, eyes fixed on him with a mix of judgment and curiosity. Some faces were filled with anger at his audacity, others with a quiet sense of admiration for the judge's composed demeanor. He had expected shock, maybe even fear, but what he encountered was something far more unsettling: quiet authority. As the judge began to speak again, her words were measured, precise, and deliberate. She addressed the courtroom at large first, reminding everyone that the court was a place where rules mattered and respect was not optional. Then her attention shifted directly to the defendant. She spoke calmly, almost conversationally, but her tone carried unmistakable firmness. She explained that standing for the judge was not about personal feelings. It was about upholding the law and showing respect for the system that protected everyone equally, regardless of wealth or status. The defendant's smirk faltered slightly, but only for a moment. He straightened in his chair, lifting his chin in a gesture of stubborn pride. He was used to being the center of attention, used to having situations bend to his will. But here, he realized, was someone who would not be swayed by intimidation, charm, or money. The courtroom, and especially the judge, was a place where equality meant something tangible. Whispers grew louder in the gallery. Spectators began speculating about what might happen next. Some wondered if the judge would reprimand the defendant immediately, while others thought she might let it slide, giving him an opportunity to save face. Lawyers continued to whisper quietly to each other, calculating the potential consequences of the defiance. Even the court officers, usually detached and routine in their duties, seemed to feel the weight of the moment, as though the air itself had become heavier. The defendant leaned back again, crossing his legs and folding his hands. He had faced opposition before, but this felt different. There was a subtle realization that the courtroom was not just a physical space. It was a stage for authority, integrity, and accountability. His usual tactics of charm, threats, or manipulation were ineffective here. The judge's calm composure was more powerful than any anger or loud voice he could produce. The prosecution decided to seize the moment. Standing, they addressed the jury and the spectators, highlighting the importance of respect and accountability in the legal system. They reminded everyone that the law was meant to protect people equally, not to serve the interests of the wealthy or powerful. Every word reinforced the message. Arrogance and privilege do not give someone the right to disregard rules, especially in a courtroom. Meanwhile, the defense team tried to intervene, speaking quietly to the judge, attempting to explain their client's behavior as a misunderstanding or a moment of poor judgment. But the judge listened politely, her expression unchanged, and then returned her attention to the defendant. Her patience was deliberate, a signal that while she was open to hearing explanations, she would not tolerate disrespect. It was a subtle reminder that authority did not need to shout. It simply existed, undeniable and absolute. The defendant began to shift in his seat, a small but noticeable sign of discomfort. He had expected to intimidate, to show the world that he could act above the rules. Instead, he felt the weight of the judge's presence pressing down on him, a force that could not be swayed by wealth or influence. The audience sensed this shift, a quiet thrill running through those who had been watching the courtroom drama unfold. There was a sense of anticipation, as if everyone were waiting for the moment when the arrogance of privilege would meet the unyielding power of justice. Reporters in the courtroom continued to scribble notes and record videos. Outside, social media was already alive with commentary. Clips of the defendant refusing to stand were shared and reshared, along with captions emphasizing the courage and composure of the judge. People debated the meaning of respect, the role of wealth in society, and the importance of accountability. The incident quickly became more than just a courtroom moment. It became a symbol, a reminder that no one is above the law. The judge addressed the defendant again, her voice calm but firm. She reminded him of the expectations in her courtroom, that the law applied to everyone equally, and that his behavior could not go without consequence. The courtroom felt the gravity of her words. There was no drama, no excessive emotion, just the quiet authority of someone who knew that actions had consequences, and that justice required clarity and fairness. For the first time, the defendant's confidence seemed to waver. He looked around the room, noticing the eyes of the spectators, the jury, and even his own legal team. There was a subtle tension in his shoulders, a small but unmistakable acknowledgement that he could not simply bully his way out of this situation. The judge's composure, combined with the unspoken judgment of everyone present, created an invisible pressure that even his wealth could not counter. The courtroom remained silent, everyone waiting for the next move. The defendant finally adjusted in his seat, a subtle acknowledgement that the situation was more serious than he had anticipated. There was no dramatic surrender, no loud apology, but a quiet, almost imperceptible shift in posture. The audience noticed, understanding that this was the beginning of a reckoning, a moment where arrogance would meet accountability. As the proceedings continued, the judge maintained her calm authority. She listened carefully to every word, every explanation, every attempt at justification. But she did so with the understanding that fairness required more than listening. It required action. The defendant's defiance had created a clear test of character, both for him and for everyone observing. How he responded next would shape the perception of justice in the room and beyond. The spectators remained on edge, some holding their breath, some leaning forward, eager to witness the unfolding drama. The air was thick with anticipation, the kind of tension that makes ordinary moments feel extraordinary. Every movement, every glance, every small gesture carried significance. In that moment, the courtroom was more than just a room. It was a stage for a larger lesson about respect, accountability, and the power of integrity. The defendant, meanwhile, seemed to realize that the situation was no longer entirely under his control. He had expected to dominate, to assert his status, to make everyone in the room bend to his will. Instead, he faced a challenge he could not simply dismiss. The judge's calm authority and the silent expectations of the courtroom had created a moment of reckoning, a subtle but undeniable reminder that privilege alone could not protect him from the consequences of his actions. For the first time, a flicker of doubt crossed his face. It was small, almost imperceptible, but enough to be noticed by the keen observers in the room. He shifted slightly in his seat, his hands moving nervously. The spectators sensed the change, a quiet thrill running through the gallery. The arrogance that had filled the room moments before was beginning to meet the reality of accountability. The judge spoke again, her words carefully chosen. She emphasized that the courtroom was a place of equality, that no one could act above the rules, and that respect was not optional. Her tone was calm, her delivery precise, and her authority unquestionable. Every person in the room felt the weight of her words. It was a moment of clarity, a demonstration that justice does not depend on wealth, charm, or status. It depends on integrity, fairness, and the willingness to hold people accountable. The defendant The courtroom had shifted from quiet tension to an almost electric sense of anticipation. Everyone there knew that what had happened, the defiance, the refusal to stand, was no ordinary act. It was a deliberate challenge to the authority of the court, and now the question on everyone's mind was, what would the consequences be? The defendant sat back in his chair, hands folded, trying to maintain the same arrogance he had carried in earlier moments. But beneath that carefully constructed exterior there was a ripple of uncertainty, a subtle acknowledgement that his usual tactics might not work here. The judge leaned forward slightly, resting her hands lightly on the bench. Her eyes scanned the room, pausing briefly on the defendant and then moving to the jury, the lawyers and the spectators. She didn't need to raise her voice or make dramatic gestures. Her presence alone conveyed authority and seriousness. She had seen defiance before, but this felt different. This wasn't a matter of misunderstanding or accident. This was deliberate, calculated, and intended to test the patience of the court. The murmurs around the courtroom grew quieter as everyone sensed the seriousness of the moment. Spectators leaned in, reporters scribbled notes furiously, and the jury sat in rigid attention, trying to mask their reactions, but unable to hide the curiosity and tension that filled the air. The defendant, normally the center of attention and confident in his control, shifted slightly in his seat. He glanced around, perhaps hoping for a sign of support from the audience, but there was none. The judge's calm authority had effectively taken over the room, and it was clear that no amount of wealth or influence could change that. The judge began to speak again, her voice steady and deliberate. She reminded the defendant of the rules and expectations of the courtroom. Standing for the judge was not a matter of personal pride. It was a basic protocol, a symbol of respect for the law that applied equally to everyone. Her words were measured, but they carried undeniable weight. Every person in the room could feel the importance of what she was saying. This was not just about one man refusing to stand. It was about the integrity of the entire legal system and the principle that no one, no matter how wealthy or powerful, could act above it. The defendant's reaction was subtle but noticeable. He leaned back slightly, crossed his arms again, and offered a faint smirk, as if to suggest he didn't take the warning seriously. Yet even in that smirk, there was a tension that hadn't been there before. For the first time, he might have realized that his usual tactics, arrogance, intimidation, and the implicit power of money, were not enough. The courtroom was a different kind of arena, one where the rules were clear and the authority was absolute. The prosecution seized the moment, standing to address the court. They emphasized the importance of accountability and respect in the legal system. They pointed out that the law exists to protect everyone, not just those with power or wealth. This was an opportunity to illustrate a broader principle. Society functions because everyone follows the rules, and violations of protocol, especially deliberate ones, must be addressed. Their words resonated throughout the room, reinforcing the idea that the courtroom was a place of fairness and equality. The defense, on the other hand, tried to minimize the incident. They spoke quietly to the judge, suggesting that the defendant's actions were not meant as an insult, perhaps framing them as a misunderstanding or a moment of carelessness. The judge listened politely, but remained unmoved. Her expression did not change, and when she addressed the courtroom again, it was clear that she had already made up her mind. Respect for the law was not optional, and deliberate defiance could not be excused, regardless of the reasoning offered by the defense. The audience sensed the tension increasing. People who had entered the courtroom merely as observers now felt as though they were witnessing something far more significant, a confrontation between privilege and principle, arrogance and authority. The courtroom was alive with quiet energy. Every glance, every movement, every small gesture seemed to carry meaning. Even the officers and court staff who normally went about their duties with a detached professionalism were subtly leaning forward, caught in the drama of the moment. The defendant shifted again, this time more noticeably. His eyes flicked briefly toward the jury, perhaps seeking sympathy or understanding. Instead, he found a panel of people who were quietly observing, analyzing every detail, trying to maintain their composure while also acknowledging the seriousness of his actions. He realized that no amount of charm or subtle intimidation would sway them. The weight of the moment was pressing down, and he could feel it, even if he refused to admit it outwardly. The judge's voice broke the silence again. She explained that defiance of court rules, especially in a deliberate and disrespectful manner, carried consequences. She didn't yell or berate. She simply stated the facts, laid out the principles, and highlighted the responsibility that everyone in the room shared. The courtroom felt her words like a force that made people sit straighter, lean forward, and pay attention. The calm power of the judge was a reminder that authority is most effective when it is quiet, consistent, and principled. The defendant's posture began to show subtle signs of discomfort. The smirk that had defined his earlier confidence was fading, replaced by a tense, rigid expression. He shifted in his seat, crossed his arms tighter, and tapped his fingers on the armrest. For the first time, it seemed as if he was questioning whether his wealth and influence could protect him here. The courtroom had effectively removed all the shields he had relied on in the outside world. Whispers started again among the spectators, but this time they were more subdued, reflective. People were analyzing the situation, speculating about the potential consequences, and discussing the broader implications. This was no longer just about one man's defiance. It had become a lesson about respect, responsibility, and the rule of law. The courtroom itself felt like a living example of those principles. The judge continued reinforcing the idea that accountability was essential in a functioning society. She emphasized that deliberate acts of disrespect could not go unaddressed, and that consequences were necessary to maintain fairness and integrity. Her words were firm, yet delivered with the calm authority of someone who understood that true power comes from knowledge, experience, and consistency, rather than loudness or intimidation. The defendant's frustration was becoming more evident. He shifted in his chair, leaned forward slightly, and muttered something under his breath. No one heard clearly, but the tension in his body was unmistakable. The arrogance that had dominated his presence earlier was now being tested by the quiet, unyielding authority of the judge. The courtroom, which had seemed like a stage for his power, was instead showing him that control here was not his to claim. The prosecution added more weight to the moment, drawing attention to the principle that no individual should feel above the law. They explained that respect for the courtroom was not merely symbolic, it was a cornerstone of justice itself. The jury, spectators, and even the defendant could feel the truth in those words. The law existed to protect society, and attempts to disregard it would always face consequences, no matter how wealthy or influential the person might be. The judge observed everything carefully, letting the defendant and the courtroom absorb the seriousness of the situation. She allowed small pauses, knowing that silence could sometimes communicate more than words. In those pauses, the defendant's discomfort grew. He realized that his usual tactics of charm, defiance, or subtle intimidation were ineffective here. The courtroom had a rhythm, an order, and it was not controlled by him. Even the spectators, some of whom had initially come merely out of curiosity, felt the weight of what was happening. This was a real demonstration of accountability in action. People whispered quietly among themselves, noting the courage, composure, and authority of the judge. Some admired the way she handled the situation without anger or theatrics. Others were drawn into the drama, captivated by the unfolding confrontation between arrogance and law. The defendant began to realize the magnitude of the situation. His earlier confidence was waning, replaced by a cautious awareness that he could not simply defy the court without consequence. He had underestimated the judge's ability to maintain authority calmly and decisively. The courtroom had become a space where principles mattered more than status, and he was now experiencing firsthand the limitations of privilege when confronted with integrity. The judge continued to lay out the expectations for behavior in her courtroom. She explained that respect was not a favor, it was a responsibility. She spoke of fairness, equality, and accountability, making it clear that the rules applied to everyone equally. Her words were deliberate, and they carried the kind of quiet authority that made people listen closely. Every member of the courtroom could sense the gravity of the situation. The defendant, seated but tense, could no longer ignore the implications. He had faced challenges before, but this was different. This was a direct test of his arrogance, his sense of entitlement, and his belief that money could shield him from consequences. The courtroom was no longer a place where he could command attention or manipulate outcomes. It was a space governed by law, integrity, and the unwavering authority of someone who. The courtroom was quieter than ever, the air thick with anticipation. Everyone was waiting, holding their breath, wondering what the judge would do next. The defendant sat in his chair, shifting slightly, hands folded tightly on his lap, trying to maintain the same air of arrogance he had carried since the beginning. But there was no mistaking the tension now. His smirk had faded, replaced by a subtle tightness in his jaw and a flicker of worry in his eyes. The judge's eyes swept across the courtroom, pausing on the defendant for a moment that felt longer than it actually was. She didn't raise her voice, didn't pound her gavel. Her presence alone was commanding. The quiet authority she carried had transformed the energy of the room. Spectators leaned forward in their seats. Reporters tightened their grips on their notebooks, and the jury members sat in attentive silence, aware that they were witnessing something remarkable. Finally, the judge spoke, her voice calm but resolute. She reminded everyone in the courtroom that the law existed to maintain fairness, equality, and accountability. She emphasized that respect in her courtroom was not negotiable and that deliberate acts of defiance had consequences. Her words were firm but measured, the kind that left no room for argument. This wasn't about anger or personal offense. It was about upholding principles that everyone depended on, regardless of wealth, influence, or social standing. The defendant shifted uneasily in his seat. He had expected theatrics, shouting, or even intimidation from the judge, but instead he faced calm authority, the kind that couldn't be swayed or frightened. He could feel the weight of every eye in the room, the scrutiny of spectators, the quiet judgment of the jury, and the professional focus of the lawyers. In that moment, he began to understand something he had never faced before. Status and money could not override respect or the law. The judge continued, detailing the seriousness of the defendant's behavior. She explained that refusing to stand was more than a minor infraction. It was a deliberate act of disrespect toward the institution of justice. She reminded everyone that in a courtroom, rules were not suggestions. They were the foundation of a fair and functioning society. Every person in the courtroom could feel the truth in her words, and even the defendant, trying to maintain composure, could not ignore them. She then addressed the defendant directly, her gaze steady and unwavering. She explained that his actions could not go unacknowledged and that accountability was essential to maintain the integrity of the court. There was no anger in her voice, no personal attack, only a clear and undeniable statement. The law applied to him, just as it applied to everyone else. The room seemed to hold its breath, sensing that a pivotal moment had arrived. For a long moment, the defendant simply stared at the judge, as if trying to calculate a way out. He opened his mouth, closed it, and tried to maintain his composure. But the reality was clear. There was no escaping the principles at work in that courtroom. Every tactic he had used in the past, every bit of influence or wealth he had wielded outside the court, held no weight here. This was not about negotiations or deals. This was about justice. The judge then delivered the first part of her decision. She declared that the defendant's behavior had violated the decorum of the court and constituted contempt. She explained that such behavior, if left unchecked, could undermine the authority of the legal system and set a dangerous precedent. The courtroom remained silent, everyone hanging on her words, aware that they were witnessing a moment that transcended a single trial. It was a reaffirmation of law, order, and fairness. The defendant's body language shifted again. He leaned forward slightly, gripping the arms of his chair. The smugness that had defined his presence was gone, replaced by a flicker of shock and a subtle fear that he could not hide. For the first time, he realized that the courtroom and the judge operated on principles far stronger than his own arrogance or social power. Every person watching could sense that this was a turning point. Next, the judge announced a series of consequences. She imposed fines and procedural penalties, emphasizing that the purpose was not punishment for the sake of punishment, but to uphold respect for the law. Every sentence she delivered was measured, and yet carried a weight that made the room feel heavier with every word. The defendant's lawyer tried to interject softly, attempting to argue for leniency, but the judge listened politely and then returned to the matter at hand. The authority in her voice made it clear this was not negotiable. The room felt the tension deepen as she continued. She reminded everyone that accountability was not optional, and deliberate attempts to undermine the court could not be ignored. She spoke about equality, fairness, and responsibility, ensuring that every person present understood the stakes. Even the spectators, some of whom had come simply out of curiosity, felt the gravity of the moment. This was not entertainment. It was a lesson in justice. The defendant's reactions were subtle but telling. His shoulders slumped slightly, his hands fidgeted, and his eyes darted toward the gallery. The reality of his situation was sinking in. His wealth, his influence, and his arrogance, which had carried him through countless challenges before, could not protect him here. The courtroom had stripped him of the shields he relied on, leaving only him and the consequences of his actions. Reporters in the courtroom scribbled furiously and whispered into their microphones. Outside, social media was already buzzing with clips of the trial and commentary on the judge's authority and the defendant's defiance. People were debating the implications, praising the judge's calm and principled stance, and reflecting on what it meant for accountability in society. The courtroom, once a private space, had become a symbol of fairness and integrity in the public eye. The judge paused for a moment, allowing the weight of her words to settle. The silence that followed was heavy, but purposeful. Everyone in the courtroom felt the significance of the moment. The defendant, still seated, looked around, perhaps realizing that this was no ordinary trial. His earlier confidence was replaced by a growing awareness that he was being held accountable in a way he had never experienced before. Then came the final part of her judgment, the moment that would stun everyone in the room. She delivered a statement that combined legal consequences with a clear moral message. Deliberate disrespect, arrogance, and attempts to undermine the authority of the court would not be tolerated. The courtroom remained silent, hanging on every word. The defendant's reaction was visible to everyone. His eyes widened slightly, his jaw tightened, and his hands clenched. For the first time, he seemed genuinely taken aback. The judge concluded by emphasizing that respect, fairness, and accountability were not optional in her courtroom. She reminded everyone that justice applied equally to all, and that actions had consequences. Her words were simple, clear, and powerful, carrying an authority that could not be challenged. The audience, the jury, and even the lawyers recognized the significance of what they had just witnessed. It was more than a ruling. It was a reaffirmation of principles that governed society. The defendant remained silent, the weight of the judgment settling over him. His defiance had met with calm, authority, and the result was a reckoning that he could not escape. The courtroom had been transformed from a place of tension into a stage for justice, where principles prevailed over privilege and law triumphed over arrogance. The spectators slowly began to exhale, some leaning back in their seats, some whispering to each other in disbelief. Reporters captured every detail, aware that they were documenting a moment that would resonate far beyond the courtroom. The jury, who had watched closely, felt the clarity of the law in action. Even the court officers who had witnessed countless cases seemed to recognize the unique significance of what had just unfolded. The defendant finally looked down, his posture slumping slightly. The arrogance that had defined him from the beginning was gone, replaced by a quiet, reluctant acknowledgement of the consequences. He realized, perhaps for the first time, that wealth and status could not shield him from accountability, and that respect for the law was not a choice. It was a requirement. The judge gave a final nod, signaling that the decision was complete. Her calm authority had carried the day, proving that integrity, patience, and fairness could confront even the most stubborn defiance. The courtroom slowly began to return to normal, but the energy in the room had changed. People left with a sense of having witnessed something remarkable, a moment that reaffirmed the power of justice and the importance of accountability. Outside, the story spread quickly. Social media discussions, news articles, and conversations highlighted the significance of the judgment. People praised the judge for her composure and fairness, and the defendant became a cautionary example of what happens when arrogance meets accountability. It was a story that captured attention, inspired reflection, and reminded everyone that respect and fairness are not negotiable. They are the foundation of justice. The courtroom had witnessed a powerful moment. A wealthy, arrogant man challenged the authority of the law, only to be reminded that principles and integrity hold more weight than wealth or status. The judgment had stunned everyone, leaving a lasting impression not only on the defendant, but on every person who had observed the trial. It was a lesson in humility, accountability. The courtroom had emptied slowly, the echoes of the gavel fading into a quiet murmur. Spectators left in groups, whispering among themselves, replaying every detail of the trial in their minds. The story had spread beyond the walls of the courthouse. News, cameras captured the reactions. Reporters shared every word, and social media was alive with clips of the judge delivering her judgment. People were debating it, analyzing it, and reflecting on what it all meant. The judgment had not just been a legal decision, it had become a statement about fairness, respect, and accountability. The defendant sat alone for a moment, the weight of the judgment pressing down like a heavy blanket. The arrogance he had carried so confidently from the beginning had all but vanished, replaced by a tense awareness of what he had done. He shifted in his chair, running his hands over his face, and for the first time, seemed genuinely unsettled. The realization had sunk in that wealth and social influence could not protect him in this room, where principles and integrity held absolute power. Lawyers approached him quietly, speaking in low voices. They attempted to explain the judgment, discuss the penalties, and strategize next steps. But the defendant barely heard them. His thoughts were elsewhere, turning over every action, every word, and every choice that had led him to this moment. For the first time in a long while, he felt the weight of accountability. It was uncomfortable, unfamiliar, and undeniable. Outside the courtroom, the city seemed alive with conversation. Pedestrians stopped to discuss the events, journalists conducted impromptu interviews, and social media feeds filled with commentary. Clips of the judge's calm authority and the defendant's defiance went viral, sparking discussions about power, privilege, and fairness. People debated the meaning of respect and accountability, and many praised the judge for her composed, yet firm handling of the situation. The courtroom had become more than a place of law. It had become a stage for an important lesson in society. The spectators who had attended the trial felt a quiet pride in witnessing it firsthand. Many commented on how the judge had handled everything with such dignity and authority. There was no anger, no humiliation inflicted beyond what was necessary, just clear principles applied fairly. It was a reminder that justice does not need theatrics to be effective. The audience left with more than just a story. They carried a lesson about courage, integrity, and the power of calm authority. For the defendant, the lesson was more personal. His previous sense of invincibility was gone. He had believed that money, status, and connections could allow him to act without consequences. He had assumed that arrogance and charm could shield him from accountability. But now, after facing the judge's unwavering authority, he was forced to confront the reality that respect for the law was not optional. Actions had consequences, and privilege could not erase them. The penalties imposed were more than financial. They were symbolic reminders of accountability. Fines, procedural sanctions, and a public reprimand were all designed to reinforce a single truth. Deliberate disrespect in a courtroom cannot be ignored. Each aspect of the judgment carried a message both to the defendant and to society at large. It was not revenge, it was principle. It was a demonstration that integrity, fairness, and respect for rules matter, even when confronting someone who has spent a lifetime believing they are above them. The defendant walked out of the courtroom slowly, his posture stiff, his expression sober. He did not smile or boast. The confidence he had carried for so long had been replaced by introspection. On the way out, he passed the spectators, reporters, and lawyers, and for a fleeting moment, it seemed as though he understood the broader impact of the moment. People looked at him differently now, not because he was punished, but because they had witnessed the undeniable assertion of fairness and justice over arrogance. Outside, the air was alive with conversation. The trial had become a talking point across the city, a symbol of accountability and equality. Passers-by discussed the way the judge had handled the situation, noting her calm authority and the fairness with which she treated the case. Social media platforms were filled with commentary praising the principles displayed in the courtroom. It was clear that this moment had left an impression far beyond the legal community. It had become part of a larger discussion about ethics, respect, and societal norms. The courtroom staff and officers who had been part of the trial reflected quietly on what they had witnessed. For them, it was a reminder of the importance of procedure, discipline, and integrity in maintaining order. Every interaction in the courtroom, every decision made contributed to the lesson of accountability. It was more than just a legal process, it was a demonstration of how principles can guide behavior, influence perception, and ensure fairness. Even the lawyers who had represented the defendant experienced a shift. They realized that this was not simply about winning or losing a case. It was about understanding the boundaries of behavior and the importance of respect in formal settings. The defendant had tested those boundaries, and the courtroom had responded decisively. It was a moment of reflection for everyone involved, a reminder that the law serves not only to punish, but also to uphold societal values. The public, following the story through news and social media, reacted with a mix of awe and relief. Many people were inspired by the way the judge handled the situation. She had not succumbed to theatrics or anger. She had simply applied the law with clarity and fairness. The judgment became a talking point for discussions about ethics, responsibility, and the importance of standing up for principle, even when faced with arrogance and power. Meanwhile, the defendant's reputation outside the courtroom began to shift. People who had previously admired his confidence and success now viewed him through a different lens. The incident served as a reminder that no amount of wealth or status could excuse disrespect or arrogance when confronted by principle. He had learned a difficult lesson, one that would stay with him long after the courtroom emptied and the news cycle moved on. In private reflection, the defendant thought back to the moment when he had refused to stand. He replayed the scene in his mind, the judge's calm gaze, the quiet authority, the unwavering focus on fairness. It was a humbling experience, one that forced him to confront the limits of privilege and the importance of integrity. For the first time, he realized that respect is earned, not demanded, and that accountability applies to everyone equally. The judge, meanwhile, returned to her chambers with the same quiet professionalism that had marked her throughout the trial. She did not seek recognition or praise. Her focus remained on the principles she upheld, on ensuring fairness, and on maintaining the dignity of the court. Yet her actions left a lasting impression on everyone who had witnessed them, showing that true authority is grounded in consistency, calmness, and integrity, rather than force or intimidation. In the days that followed, the story continued to spread. Discussions about respect, equality, and accountability filled classrooms, workplaces, and homes. People debated the meaning of privilege, the power of law, and the importance of standing by principle. The courtroom episode became more than a trial. It became a lesson in ethics, a reminder that actions have consequences, and that respect for the rules is essential for fairness in society. The defendant began to experience the long-term impact of the judgment. He faced scrutiny from peers, media, and colleagues, and he had to confront the reality of accountability in a way he never had before. The humbling experience changed his perspective, reminding him that arrogance and entitlement cannot replace responsibility and respect. It was a lesson that would stay with him, shaping future decisions and interactions. Meanwhile, for the spectators and the public, the story offered hope. It was a reminder that justice can prevail, even when confronted with arrogance and power. It showed that integrity, calm authority, and adherence to principle are stronger than wealth, influence, or intimidation. The courtroom had become a symbol, a story that inspired reflection on fairness, respect, and the responsibilities that come with privilege. The incident also highlighted the importance of human dignity in legal proceedings. The judge had handled everything with professionalism and respect, ensuring that the defendant was held accountable without humiliation or unnecessary drama. It was a demonstration that justice is most powerful when it is fair, measured, and principled. Everyone who witnessed it left with a sense of clarity about what accountability truly means. In the end, the trial and the judgment became a story about more than one courtroom confrontation. It was about the broader principles that govern society, the importance of respect, the need for accountability, and the way integrity can overcome arrogance. For the defendant, it was a moment of personal reckoning. For the public, it was a lesson in ethics and fairness. For the judge, it was a quiet affirmation of the authority and responsibility that come with upholding the law. The lessons of the day lingered. People continued to talk about the case, to reflect on its significance, and to share the story with others. The courtroom had been more than a place for legal proceedings. It had been a stage for a demonstration of principle, a place where the actions of one individual were held against the values that sustain society. And in that space, everyone, spectators,